Welcome back to the countdown with Dean Kirk. We're at number 17, up 11 from 28. Fantasy playlist, August 29th, 1987. John Cougar with Paper and Fire from the album The Lonesome Jubilee. There was a YouTube comment I saw before I did this video that stuck out at me. And I don't want to get on my soapbox again, but I guess I will. The person commented that John Cougar, this song sounded natural. I mean, he's playing his instruments. I mean, it's the real deal. This song's the real deal, as opposed to a lot of music that came out in the late 80s that was overproduced, in his view. But I kind of agree with it to some extent. And I'm going to be honest with you. I've been listening to music. I've been into this pop music for decades now, before the 80s and after the 80s. And one thing I noticed, a lot of people who grew up in the 80s and 90s, they come down on today's music saying that it's terrible, that it's awful, 80s music is the best and all that. But I want to point out to you that back in the 80s, a lot of older people hated 80s music compared to the 60s and 70s. I remember one time, Paul McCartney, before he went on tour in 1989, saw this on an interview on MTV. He condemned the music of that era. This was in 1989 when he released a new album. And My Brave Face was becoming a big single for him. And before he went on tour, he commented that a lot of today's music, late 80s music, was synthetic. That a lot of people, which is why a lot of people wanted to flock to see the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones had released a new album in 1989. And a friend of mine, and boy, he grew up. Well, he graduated in the 60s. And boy, we'd sit down and talk about 60s music, early 70s music, mid to late 50s music. But boy, he hated 80s music. He hated it. He liked Def Leppard, but he just condemned 80s music. He told me flat out, you know something? A lot of today's music, talking about the late 80s now, we're in the late 80s when he made this comment. Might have been early 90s. A lot of today's music is just plastic, Dean. Just absolute plastic. It's just... Now, here's the thing. I feel kind of ambivalent about all this. Don't get me wrong. A lot of great music, a lot of good songs came out in the 80s, no doubt about it. There is some truth that some of it was probably overproduced. But there's so many dynamics that go into popular music, no matter what decade you're in, that it's just, you can't, a lot of people do it anyway, but you just can't pigeonhole songs and pigeonhole music in just one lump, saying that it's all bad. Because you got jazz, you got R&B, you got hip-hop, you got pop, you got dance, you got all kinds of music. And not all of it's bad. And I listened to an oldies show back in the 80s. And DJ was a great oldies, he was a great oldies DJ. But he read some letters from his listeners one night. And one of the listeners told him, he said, this was in the 80s now. The guy told him, the listener said, today's music is terrible. It's horrible. This was in 1987. But then the DJ said, well, not all of it's bad. I'm a Bruce Springsteen fan. So it's complicated. It's not that simple. I don't care what anybody says. It's just not that simple. But that depends on what one's taste in music is, and sometimes reality is highly subjective. And let me get off my soapbox. It is now, let's get back into the music now, get it back into John Cougar. And yes, indeed, he did keep it real for sure. John Cougar was one of those guys who never was blindsided by fame, never got into the garish aspects of high-rolling living, the glitz, the bling, the limousines, and all that. He stayed true to his working-class Midwestern heartland roots. And this record makes a social commentary about the racial inequalities, about the income disparities. The album and the song touches on it, Paper and Fire, that still applies to today. That's what makes this song so universal. It's still, the themes are still riveting in the present, right now in 2022. And I would venture to guess, if somehow you watch this video and say the year 2062 or 2082, if it lasts that long, Probably the same issues you'll probably be dealing with. You'll probably be seeing the same issues down the road. Well, anyway, that's what the song is about. The video was shot outside of a house. It was shot outside of a house in Savannah, Georgia, on a dirt road. And he just wanted to just show the poverty in America, that the American dream is not attainable for everyone. That dreams can be shattered, easily shattered. Save up a nest egg, build up a nest egg, build up your reputation, your skills and all that, and have it all go up in smoke. All right, John Cougar Mellencamp, The Lonesome Jubilee. The album now was a little bit different. It had that Appalachian influence, used a fiddle, and that leads me to a couple of shout-outs here. The fiddle player, her name is Lisa Germano, Germano. The accordion played by John Cascello, Cascella, and also, there's another thing about this album, too, about this song. It was personal to some extent for John Cougar because his grandfather and his uncle passed away. And a lot of his friends were getting divorced. So there was a lot of infusion of personal angst, along with the social commentary that just fell right into this song, stewed right into this record. There's a line in that record. We keep, the quote, let me do the quote unquote thing, quote, we keep no check on our appetites. That was a line from a movie called HUD back in 1963. And John Cougar was so enamored with that movie, he called his son HUD, called one of his sons HUD. Here's another factoid about John Cougar. I found this out when I researched it. When he was very young, an infant, he had a condition called spina bifida. Bifida, I believe is how you pronounce it, bifida. It's a condition where the spinal cord is not completely formed. And it's just hasn't completely matured. A deformed spinal cord. Bottom line is most children don't survive it. But there was 4 children that had surgery. He was picked. 1 out of 4 kids. John Cougar, 1 out of 4. He went through surgery to correct this problem at Riley's Children's Hospital in Indianapolis. 4 children, including John Cougar. 3 of those children died. 3 of them died. They didn't make it. John Cougar did. Didn't know about it until he was 11 years old. A kid at school said to John, you got a big scar on the back of your neck. I mean, what is it? And John asked his dad what happened, about the scar, and his dad explained to him about the surgery. I tell you what, though, it did save him from the draft. Sure did. 1969, John Cougar turned 18 years old. The Vietnam War, even though Nixon was starting to withdraw troops from Vietnam, it was still raging, though. War was still raging in Vietnam, and the draft was in force. I think the lottery itself went into effect in 1969. But John Cougar, he was exempted from the draft because of that operation, because of that condition. So he got very lucky, and that's good because I tell you what, he put out some good rock and roll. Remember his first song, I Need a Lover Who Won't Drive Me Crazy? I remember listening to that on Casey Kasem back in 1979. But that's all I got to say about this record right here. It's a fine rock and roll record, and just very satisfying. Got the social commentary in there. Kind of reminiscent of the 60s in a way, when you had a lot of the protest music and songs that would make commentaries about the social inequalities and whatever. Well, at number 28, actually up from 28 to number 17, John Cougar, Paper and Fire, fantasy playlist of August 29th, 1987.